You know, every problem in society, hunger, domestic violence, poverty, it walks into your doors, doesn't it? You see it every day. And at a time when we in the wealthiest country in the history of the world have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, you are demanding, and I am demanding, a change in national priorities. At a time when we have a dysfunctional child care system, in which all over this country, Vermont, Chicago, all over this country, working class people cannot find the quality, affordable child care they need, you are standing up for a change in national priorities. At a time when great teachers, experienced teachers, are leaving the profession because they can't make an income to support their families, you are standing up for a change in national priorities. You want, and I want, that the teaching profession receive the honor and respect it deserves for the enormously important work you do. And I'm not here just to flatter you. I'm not here to say nice things about you. What I'm here to say is what you know. Anybody, and I hear all these politicians, they got big flags behind them. They tell us how much they love America. If you love America, you love the children of America. If you love the children of America, you love the people who educate and take care of those children.
Bernie Sanders was talking to a raucous crowd at a rally for the Chicago Teachers Union. Sanders, oftentimes on these stump speeches, will make this argument that 500,000 people go bankrupt each year because they can't afford to pay their medical bills. Now, he's not talking specifically about medical bills in this particular moment. He's talking about teaching and teachers' unions and everything else. But when Sanders is on the stump, he typically makes that point. The Washington Post came out and gave that 3 Pinocchios. 3 Pinocchios. It is weird that they would give that 3 Pinocchios and call it flawed, seeing as their own newspaper says the opposite. Meaning, Sanders didn't pull this out of nowhere. His argument that 500,000 people go without health care was based on a study, or go bankrupt because they don't have health care was based on a study. The Washington Post does something that's admirable. It contacts the person in the study. Now, typically, I would imagine they don't particularly do this. And if Sanders is using a study to back this up, then you can't say that Sanders is flawed or wrong or any of those things. But the Washington Post contacts the person from the study. The person from the study says, yes, what Sanders is telling you is accurate. 500,000 people go bankrupt without health insurance. Right here. And this is also the Washington Post, the exact same newspaper that said what Sanders said was flawed and gave him 3 Pinocchios, again, despite contacting the person who was in charge of the study, and that person who did the work of that study says what Sanders is saying is right. And don't take my word for it. Don't take the person who started the study's word for it, who did the study. Take Washington Post's word for it, who the person who did that fact check may not read, or potentially don't read Washington Post. This study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that before the ACA went into effect, 66.5% of people in debt cited medical concerns contributing to bankruptcy, compared to 67.5% in the 3 years after the implementation of the law. It found that 530,000 families deal with bankruptcies related to illness or medical debt. If I'm not mistaken, the guy from the study said, well, Sanders is right, but Sanders is underestimating the problem. The problem is really an estimate about 500,000 people each year go bankrupt. Why am I bringing this up? Why am I bringing up the Washington Post? Why am I making the point that the Washington Post laughably, shamefully, sadly said that what Sanders was saying was false when that exact same Washington Post backs up what Sanders is saying is true? Yesterday, technically, Sanders put out a wealth tax. He put out a proposal for a wealth tax. Sanders floated this proposal for a wealth tax back in 1991. In 2017, he came out with the legislation for it. Yesterday, he came out with his proposal for a wealth tax that will raise $4 trillion. The Washington Post finds out about this. Sanders is putting a wealth tax. And what does the Washington Post say? The Washington Post comes out with a story that essentially notes the wealth tax, but gives Warren the credit. Now, this is the same organization that, on a question that Sanders answered that was very clearly dealing with this notion of birth control, the Washington Post turned that into a thing where Sanders was talking about population control, meaning he was talking about eugenics. So take what Washington Post says with a grain of salt. My only point is this. Washington Post, when presented with the 500,000 people going bankrupt, resorted to outright lunacy and ludicrousness and saying that what Sanders was saying was wrong, what Sanders was saying was right. And right now, Sanders proposes a wealth tax, proposed one in 2017, with the legislation to follow in 2017. And yet, the Washington Post gives Warren the credit for a wealth tax that Sanders had out before Warren even thought of it. This is going to be short, but welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content and you find yourself coming back often, please like, share, subscribe. Of course, you can always support through PayPal or Patreon, or for that matter, Super Chats. Guys, this show is brought to you by you. This channel and these videos are often demonetized, and I appreciate you for allowing me to do this. Bernie Sanders comes out with a wealth tax. Bernie Sanders and many lefties are often asked, how do you pay for it? How do you pay for it? How do you pay for it? And Sanders, often getting these questions, explains how, in fact, he would go about paying for it. Well, one of the ways he's decided or discerned to go about paying for it is a wealth tax. The wealth tax will raise $4 trillion and will raise and bring in more than $1 trillion over what Elizabeth Warren's plan. If I'm not mistaken, $1.4 trillion more than what Elizabeth Warren is proposing as a wealth tax. Again, I make the point that Sanders' wealth tax was around years before Warren ever thought of such, and Sanders put out the legislation for that wealth tax going back in 2017. That in no way stopped the Washington Post from running with a headline as if the wealth tax was from Warren and that Bernie Sanders was just getting on Warren's coattails for this wealth tax. It's the other way around. And every issue that you can think of, be it healthcare, be it education, it's the other way around. Weren't for these things until Warren started running in the presidential election. The Washington Post didn't care to fact check what they were running as a headline. They just ran with the headline that, okay, Sanders is proposing a wealth tax, but he's taking it from Warren. Well, don't take my word for it that Sanders' health tax was out before Warren ever came out with hers. Take BuzzFeed's. This September 20th, 2017, almost 2 years to the date, Bernie Sanders came out with a wealth tax. Doesn't stop Washington Post from running with this headline. In 2017, Sanders came out with a wealth tax. In 2019, Warren came out with a wealth tax. Later in 2019, Bernie Sanders reintroduced his wealth tax. And Washington Post, ignoring the fact that Sanders' wealth tax was out first, ran this headline. If you indeed are going to run a newspaper, shouldn't the term news to some degree be associated with reality? Meaning, if you're going to have a newspaper, if you're going to run a TV show for that matter, if you're going to dispense news and you're going to call yourself objective and all this other stuff, democracy dies in the darkness. No, democracy dies on the pages of the Washington Post in the broad daylight. One foible, one lie, one misinformation dispensed to the population after the next. I want to get into what Bernie Sanders' wealth tax is going to allow. Clearly, the reason that Bernie Sanders is putting this through is because the question is asked, how do you pay for it? And he's stuck with this notion of, well, if I'm going to have Medicare for all, if I'm going to expand Social Security, if I'm going to expand college, then I do need to have some way to explaining to the American public how I intend to pay for these policies. Bernie Sanders explains how. Wealth tax is just one arrow in a quiver and several quivers. Bernie Sanders' wealth tax concept is designed to overhaul the wealth, not annual income. Meaning this is not going to hit you. 99.9% under the sound of my voice won't be touched by this wealth tax at all. For decades, the billionaire class has been gorging on tax breaks, tax loopholes, and government subsidies. The result of that greed can be seen in the Federal Reserve data showing 20 years, the top 1% has increased their worth by $21 trillion, while the bottom 50% has declined by $900 billion. Let me repeat that. Over the last 20 years, the top 1% has increased their wealth by $21 trillion. While the bottom 50% has seen their wealth decline by $900 billion. If Bernie Sanders' wealth tax was into effect today, on the last taxes, the Walton family would have had to pay $14.8 billion. Jeff Bezos, $8.9 billion. Adelson, $2.6 billion. Murdoch, $1.28 billion. Carl Icahn, $1.2 billion. To put this in perspective, Jeff Bezos has $150 billion? If Jeff Bezos would have had to pay $8.9 billion, Jeff Bezos wouldn't have even known that the money was gone. It's like a rounding error. The interesting thing, though, is what this is designed to do. So everybody who's making, or anyone who's making over $32 million will be affected by the tax. That is nobody that I know, and most likely nobody that you know under the sound of my voice. In order to reduce the outrageous level of inequality that exists in America today and rebuild the disappearing middle class, the time has come for the United States to establish an annual tax on the extreme wealth of the top 0.1% of U.S. households. The wealth tax would only apply to net worths over $32 million and will raise an estimated $4.35 trillion with a T over the next decade. Anyone who has a net worth of less than $32 million will not see their taxes go up at all under this plan. Let me repeat. Anyone with making less than $32 million will not see their taxes raised one bit under this plan. The tax rate would increase. Oh, I see. It will start with 1% tax on net worth above $32 million for a married couple. The tax rate would increase to 2% on net worths of $50 million to $250 million, 3% to $250 million to $500 million, 4% from $500 million to $1 billion, 5% from $1 to $2.5 billion, 6% from $2.5 billion to $5 billion, 7% from $5 billion to $10 billion, and 8% on wealths above $10 billion. The these brackets are halves for singles. Meaning, if you are not a married couple, if you are single and you are making that much money, the amounts are halved. The amounts are halved. Let's keep going. Under this plan, the wealth of billionaires will be cut in half in 15 years and will substantially break up the concentration of wealth and power of the privileged class. What's interesting about this also is that he's trying to give the IRS teeth to go after people who are making billions, to prevent these guys from essentially hiding money offshore or trying to find tax loopholes in order to avoid paying their fair share. I think this is awesome. Personally, I would of course go farther than this, but if I'm being honest, this is the farthest on the political spectrum that anyone in our lifetime has ever gone. Beyond this point, this notion that there may be some people who would argue for the billionaires, pity the billionaires, I think it's somewhat problematic. If you are part of the class, of my class, the 99%, then this doesn't affect you one iota. And seeing as the billionaire class has been running roughshod over the 99%, not only do I think this is necessary, not only do I think this doesn't necessarily go far enough, even though it goes further than anybody else in my lifetime, this is what you should be doing. If you are representing a particular class, then represent that particular class. And know over the last 20 years, again, the wealth of the top 1% has increased by $21 trillion. And the people who are under my voice, wealth has gone down by $900 billion. This is the issue of class. This is a class war that has been waged on the bottom 99%, or you could say the 99% for the last 20 years. And for the first time in my lifetime, somebody who's running in a race is not only bringing that up, but at the very least trying to find remedies to this notion of concentrated power within the top 1%. This is just another reason why I support Sanders. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.